Wind tore across the main street of Dry Creek, carrying dust, scraps of paper, and rumor. The sheriff's notice was nailed to the post outside the saloon, and by dawn, everyone had read it. Every unmarried woman must present herself by noon. The men will choose wives by law. It was meant to bring order to the frontier. But for Clara Wynn, it was a sentence. Her mother's shout broke through the creaking boards of their cabin. "Up! You'll not lie there like a slug when the whole town's watching." Clara's eyes opened to the pale light of morning. The frost on the window blurred the world into silver, and for a second she hoped she'd dreamed it. But her mother's voice came again, sharper now. "They'll all be there. You will be too. You'll not shame this house by hiding." Clara sat up slowly. Her body was strong from years of work, hauling water, chopping wood. But that strength had never been admired. Her mother said it made her unfeminine. Her father had died years ago in the mines, leaving only the two of them in a world that never forgave softness or sorrow. When she stepped outside, the chill bit through her thin shawl. Down the street, girls already gathered, their ribbons bright against the gray dust. Clara felt the usual sting. She had no ribbons, no lace, just the faded brown dress she'd worn to every Sunday service since she was 16. A group of boys near the general store noticed her at once. "Well, if it isn't Clara the Ox," one called. "Best hope some poor fool needs help plowing." Laughter followed her like dogs nipping at her heels. She said nothing. She'd learned that words only made them meaner. But when she reached the well, she saw a small figure crying. A child no older than 6, sitting in the dirt beside an overturned basket of apples. Clara crouched beside him. "Did you fall, sugar?" He nodded, tears cutting clean streaks down his dusty cheeks. She helped him gather the bruised apples, wiping his face with her sleeve. "There now. Nothing broken but a few apples." The boy gave a shaky smile, the first kindness she'd seen that morning. But across the street, whispers rose again. "Always tending to strays," one woman murmured. "Can't mind her own business." Clara's hands tightened on the bucket handle. "Better strays than snakes," she muttered under her breath. The town bell clanged just then. 1, 2, 3 harsh notes echoing off the wooden walls. A voice called from the square. "All women to the courthouse steps. The choosing begins." A hush fell over Dry Creek. Shop doors opened, boots shuffled, and the town poured toward the square. Clara's mother came running from their porch, face flushed with fury. "Fix your hair. Lord above, must you look like a mule? At least pretend to be worth choosing." Clara wanted to scream that she didn't care to be chosen, not by any man who'd see her as a prize or punishment. But her mother's glare pinned her still. Moments later, they joined the others in the crowd. The sheriff stood on the platform, a parchment in his hand, deputies behind him. "Today, Dry Creek rebuilds. No woman shall live without a household, and no man without duty. Each man shall pick a wife before sundown." Clara's heart pounded. Around her, the prettier girls giggled nervously. And then, through the crowd's murmur, came a voice like rolling thunder, low, rough, defiant. "I came here for no wife," it said. The crowd turned. A tall stranger in a dark duster stood at the back, the sun glinting off his revolver. He didn't flinch when the sheriff's eyes found him. "Then you'll learn, mister," the sheriff said, stepping forward, "that in Dry Creek, the law makes the choices men won't." The wind howled through the square again. And in that stillness before the storm, Clara knew whatever happened next would change her life forever. The square of Dry Creek had never been so full or so cruel. The sheriff's men stood along the wooden platform, rifles resting across their chests. while the townsfolk crowded in close. Dust swirled in the wind, like smoke from a dying fire. Mothers clutched their daughters, whispering prayers that their names might be called by a decent man. Laughter, nervous and sharp, rolled through the air like the crackle before lightning. Clara Wynn stood at the far end of the line, her hands clasped tight around her shawl. The brown dress her mother forced her into pinched at the seams, and the color, once warm, looked dull against the sunlight. Her hair, too thick to tame, escaped its braid. She could feel every eye on her, measuring, mocking. "She's here," someone murmured behind a fan. "Heaven help us, she really came." Another voice. "No shame left in that family. Poor woman's desperate." The words slid under her skin like knives. Clara kept her gaze on the dirt, where her boots made small half-moons in the dust. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Men of Dry Creek," he called, his voice deep and heavy. "You will come forward in turn. Choose wisely. The Lord and the law are watching." The men began stepping out one by one. Some swaggered, grinning as they pointed out the prettiest faces. A few girls smiled shyly, already relieved to be chosen. But every time a man stopped to speak, the unchosen grew tenser, their fingers twisting their skirts, their breath catching. Beside Clara, a young woman began to cry softly. "What if no one calls my name?" she whispered. Clara wanted to comfort her, but she knew her own fear too well. She'd long ago accepted her fate, to be the last one standing. Then, the crowd stirred. The sheriff raised a hand for silence. "Bring him forward," he said. From the edge of the square, the tall stranger stepped into view. The same man who had refused the law only moments ago. His coat caught the wind, and the murmur spread through the people like ripples in dark water. He was younger than most had guessed, his face bronzed from sun, his eyes cold as river stones. "That's the one from the Dakota Trail," a man whispered. "He killed 3 bandits alone." "Name's Eli Mercer, I heard," another said. "Doesn't take kindly to orders." Eli stopped a few paces from the platform, his hat shadowing his face. "Sheriff," he said, voice flat. "I told you before, I didn't ride in for this." The sheriff smiled, but his eyes stayed hard. "Then ride out after. But today, you'll do as every man does." The crowd murmured its approval. Nobody defied the sheriff of Dry Creek and walked away untouched. Eli's jaw tightened. He looked across the line of women, their nervous faces turned toward him. Clara kept her eyes on the ground, willing herself invisible. "Choose," the sheriff ordered. Eli didn't move. The silence grew sharp enough to cut. The sheriff's smile faded. "You think yourself above the law, boy? I think a man's heart is his own," Eli said quietly. The sheriff took a step forward. "Not here it ain't. Not when the town's got mouths to feed and a future to build. You'll pick or I'll pick for you." And then, in one slow, cruel motion, the sheriff pointed toward Clara. "Her," he said. "The one who looks like she'd sooner break a plow than bake a loaf. She's waiting for someone brave enough to take pity." A wave of laughter erupted. Clara flinched as if struck. The world swam before her eyes, faces twisting, mouths open, teeth flashing. The laughter swelled louder, rolling over her like thunder. She wanted to run, to vanish into the ground, but her mother's voice from the crowd stopped her cold. "Don't you move. You stand there and take what comes." Her throat burned, her vision blurred. The sheriff leaned toward Eli, his voice carrying for all to hear. "Go on, Cowboy. Be a hero. Take the one no one else would." Eli stared at the sheriff, then at Clara. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers wide with humiliation, his dark with something she couldn't read. The seconds stretched. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, and then the sheriff laughed. Thought so. Even he won't. Clara's heart cracked like glass. She turned her face away, biting back tears, but they came anyway. Hot, unstoppable. Eli spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise like a blade. You talk too much, Sheriff. The laughter stopped. The wind shifted. And as every gaze swung toward him, Eli Mercer took a slow breath and said the words that would change both their lives. Her. I choose her. The crowd gasped. The sheriff's smile faltered. And in that instant, Clara knew that mercy and tragedy could wear the same face. The laughter still echoed behind them long after they'd left the square. Even from the far edge of town, Clara could hear it, a roar of mockery that trailed them like ghosts. Every step of her boots on the hard dirt felt heavier than the last. She wanted to shrink into the shadows, but there were none deep enough to hide in. Eli Mercer walked beside her, tall and quiet, his duster shifting with the wind. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just walked. His silence wasn't cruel, but it was vast. The kind of silence that could swallow a person whole. The sheriff's words still burned in her ears. Take pity on her. That's what this was, she told herself. Pity. A man's defiance twisted into charity. They reached the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, where his horse waited. A black mare with eyes like coals and a scar down one flank. Eli untied the reins, then turned to her. Can you ride? He asked. Clara hesitated. Not well. For the first time, his gaze met hers fully. Steady, unreadable, but not unkind. Then hold tight. Before she could protest, he lifted her effortlessly onto the saddle. She caught her breath, not because of the strength in his arms, but because he did it without strain or mockery, without so much as a sigh. He swung up behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of her shawl. The mare moved forward. The town faded behind them. Dust rose in soft clouds under the hooves, and the field stretched out toward the horizon, gold and endless. The sun dipped low, throwing the land in amber light. Clara kept her eyes fixed ahead, her fingers clenched on the saddle horn. Every now and then, Eli's hand brushed hers as he guided the reins. The contact was small, almost nothing. But her heart stuttered each time. She dared a question. Why did you do it? He didn't answer at once. His voice came low, like gravel underwater. Would you rather I hadn't? She turned slightly, surprised by the edge in his tone. No. Then don't ask. The words stung, but there was no cruelty in them, only weariness. Like a man tired of defending his own soul. They rode in silence for a long while. The wind softened, carrying the faint scent of sage and rain. As they neared the foothills, the first stars began to bloom overhead, quiet witnesses to their uneasy journey. When they finally reached his land, the ranch appeared through the dusk. A lonely house framed by open pasture, a lantern flickering in the window. It wasn't grand, but it was clean, solid, the kind of place that seemed to hold its breath with dignity. Eli dismounted first, then offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated. The last man who'd offered her a hand had done it to mock her. But Eli waited, patient, unmoving, until she finally placed her trembling fingers in his palm. He helped her gently, not pulling, not forcing, just steadying her as she slid down. For a moment, they stood close. The night air between them charged with something neither could name. Her shawl caught the wind, brushing against his coat. He didn't step back. Neither did she. You'll sleep inside? He said quietly. The spare room. It's warm. Clara nodded. Thank you. Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned away to tend the horse, but as he moved, she noticed a flash of silver around his neck. A locket, small and worn from touch. He caught her glance and tucked it quickly beneath his shirt. "Your wife?" she asked before she could stop herself. His hand froze on the saddle strap. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then softly, "She was." The past tense hung heavy between them. She lowered her gaze. The air felt too full, too intimate. Inside, the house was quiet. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a faint smell of cedar. On the mantel sat a single photograph. A young woman smiling, edges faded by time. Clara looked away quickly, feeling like an intruder in another life. When Eli came in, he set 2 plates on the table, bread and beans, nothing more. They ate in silence, the crackle of the lamp filling the gaps where words might have gone. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You did nothing wrong back there." Clara blinked, uncertain she'd heard right. "They laugh," he continued, eyes fixed on the fire, "because they don't know what it costs to stand still when the world's throwing stones." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her that way, as if her endurance meant something. "Good night, Mrs. Mercer," he said finally, standing. Her heart skipped at the sound of it. Mrs. Mercer, not as mockery, but as truth. When she lay awake later, the wind whispering through the cracks in the window, Clara replayed that moment over and over. The look in his eyes, the gentleness beneath his rough voice, and somewhere deep inside the ache of humiliation, a strange, dangerous warmth began to bloom. Small, fragile, but alive. Morning came to Dry Creek Ranch with the sound of roosters and wind against the shutters. Clara had hardly slept. She'd risen before dawn, her body restless, her mind tangled with questions she couldn't name. The house was quiet, but Eli was already gone. She saw his boots missing by the door, his hat gone from the hook. For a long moment, she just stood there, looking around the simple kitchen. The coals still faintly glowing in the stove, the half-empty coffee pot left on the table. It wasn't a home yet. It felt more like a refuge built by someone who'd forgotten how to live in one. So she set to work. She started small, sweeping the porch, scrubbing the tin plates, washing the grit from the window panes. But the longer she worked, the more she noticed things most wouldn't. The chicken feed barrel was half empty, the well bucket frayed along the rope. The fences out back were sagging where the posts had softened from rain. She saw it all, and she began to fix it, bit by bit. By the time Eli returned from the north pasture, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen door. He stopped at the gate, one brow raised. "You bake?" Clara shrugged, brushing flour from her sleeves. "I read how once. Didn't say it'd rise, just said it might." He took a slice, tasting. It was rough, dense, a little burnt at the edge, but he nodded. "Could be worse." Her lips twitched. "That your version of a compliment?" He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted. The first smile she'd seen on him. Over the next days, the quiet between them began to change. It wasn't the cold, punishing silence of strangers. It was a space that seemed to make room for both of them. Clara found herself watching him without meaning to. The way he'd pause before speaking, or how he'd run his thumb along the edge of his silver locket when he thought no one noticed. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Eli was out driving cattle back toward the barn when the wind picked up, sharp and wild. Clara saw it from the window, the dark sky breaking open, the herd panicking. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran outside. "Get back inside," he shouted over the storm. "The gate's open," she called back. Rain lashed against them as the cattle surged toward the gap in the fence. Eli turned, but Clara was faster. She climbed onto the fence post, rope in hand, pulling it tight across the gap just as a steer bolted. The rope snapped taut, halting the animal's rush. Mud splashed up her skirt, her hair whipping around her face, but she didn't let go. When the last of the herd was inside, Eli came running, eyes wide. "You could have been killed." Clara met his gaze, breathless. "And let them trample half your herd? You're welcome." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain softened to a whisper. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, not loud but deep, warm, unguarded. It startled her almost as much as the thunder. "You don't listen well, do you?" he said. "Only when I should," she replied. It was the first time they both smiled at the same moment. That night, he found her by the fire, stitching a tear in her dress. "You've done more in a week than most hired men in a season," he said. "I owe you wages." She looked up, surprised. "You owe me respect, not money." He studied her for a moment. "You think I haven't given you that?" "Not yet," she said, steady but soft. "You treat me kindly, but not equally. You give me room, but not trust." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And what would make you trust me?" She met his eyes. "A conversation, maybe. A chance to be heard." It was the first time he looked uncertain. "I'm not much for talking." "Then listen, you're good at that." He didn't answer right away. But the way he looked at her then, as if seeing not the awkward girl from the square, but a mind as sharp as flint, made her chest ache. Days passed. The fence held. The bread improved. And slowly, word began to travel through Dry Creek that the strange marriage between Eli Mercer and the plow girl hadn't ended in ruin. One evening, a neighbor rode by. A slick man named Calder, who'd once courted Clara's cousin. He leaned on the fence, grinning. "Eli, you sure you want to keep her? Could trade her for a pair of hands that cook better." Eli's jaw tightened. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward. "I'd trade you first," she said evenly. "You'd fetch less than the saddle you sit on." Calder blinked, then rode off without a word. Eli turned to her, a ghost of a smile tugging his lips. "Remind me never to argue with you." She tilted her head. "You wouldn't win." For the first time since she'd come to the ranch, laughter filled the air, not cruel or mocking, but shared, light and real. That night, as the firelight danced across the walls, Clara found herself thinking of how far she'd come from that square. From the jeers, the shame, the girl who couldn't lift her head. Here, she'd built something with her hands, earned her place not by beauty, but by strength and wit. She glanced toward Eli, who sat by the window polishing his revolver, the silver locket gleaming at his throat. "Eli," she said softly. He looked up. "When you chose me," she began, "was it to spite the sheriff or to save me?" His eyes lingered on her a long time before he answered. "Didn't know then," he said quietly. Might still be figuring it out. The answer should have unsettled her, but instead, it warmed her. Because somewhere in that uncertainty, she heard the truth. Whatever had begun in defiance was turning, slowly, into something else, something almost like love. The morning sun blazed hot over Dry Creek's dusty main street, setting the air shimmering. The town buzzed like a kicked beehive. Word had spread that Eli Mercer was riding in with his wife, the girl everyone laughed at. Clara sat straight in the saddle, her palms damp against the worn leather. The town she'd once feared now rose before her like a memory she refused to bow to. Faces filled the porches, women with folded arms, men pretending not to stare. She could feel their eyes burning through her shawl, searching for the same clumsy, broken creature they'd mocked. But that woman was gone. Eli rode beside her, quiet and steady as ever. His gloved hand rested loosely on the reins, his jaw set. He hadn't wanted to come back here, but Clara had insisted. "Let them see," she'd said. Let them see I'm not afraid anymore." When they reached the square, the crowd parted in uneasy silence. The sheriff was there, leaning against the post with his usual smirk. "Well, well, if it ain't the law's favorite lovebirds." His tone was syrup and dust. "Come back to show us your fine marriage, have you?" Eli dismounted first, offering his hand to Clara. She hesitated only a second before taking it. The crowd watched as her boots touched the ground, the red hem of her dress brushing against the dirt. "She looks better fed than before," someone muttered. "She always did eat well," another snickered. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Eli, and he looked back with that same wordless steadiness that had carried her through every storm since. He turned to the sheriff, voice low but cutting clear across the square. "You mock her," he said. "All of you. Because she's different. Because she doesn't fit what you think a woman should be. But I'll tell you something. She's stronger than every man here who's ever opened his mouth to laugh." A hush fell. The wind stirred dust between their boots. Eli stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. "You think the law made me choose her? You're wrong. I could have ridden away that day. I didn't. I stayed. And every day since, I've chosen her again." He turned to the crowd now, his voice rising, fierce but calm. "You all saw what you wanted, a joke, a pity marriage. But she's the one who held the fence when the storm came, who faced down your words and never broke. You talk about courage, but she lives it." The crowd shifted, some lowering their heads, others crossing their arms tighter. Clara felt her throat close, her chest tight. She hadn't asked for this defense, but hearing it, she realized how deeply she'd needed it. Eli reached out his hand. "Come here, Clara." Her breath trembled as she stepped forward. The world seemed to fall away. The people, the whispers, even the sheriff's cruel grin. She could see nothing but him. He took her hand gently, then raised his voice once more. "You all wanted a show? You'll have one." The fiddler near the saloon hesitated, looking uncertain, until Eli nodded once. "Play," and he did. A slow, haunting melody spilled into the square, soft at first, then fuller, braver. Eli's arm slipped around her waist. Clara froze, half from fear, half from disbelief. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't look at them," he whispered. "Look at me." She did. They began to move, slowly, in time with the music. At first her feet stumbled, clumsy as they had always been. But Eli guided her, not pulling, not forcing, just steadying. One step, then another. His touch was sure, his gaze never wavering. The laughter that had begun to rise faltered. Clara's fear melted away, replaced by something fierce and bright. Her body, once mocked, now moved with purpose. The rhythm of the music matched the beat of her heart. Eli drew her closer, his hand at her back, his other still holding hers. The world around them blurred into color and dust and heat. He leaned in, his voice barely audible over the music. "They don't matter," he murmured. "Only this." And then, without hesitation, he kissed her. It wasn't soft or timid. It was raw, hungry, and full of everything neither of them had dared to say. The crowd gasped, a wave of shock rolling through the square. But Eli didn't pull away, and Clara didn't let him. Her fingers tangled in the fabric of his coat, her body pressed against his as if the two of them were a single heartbeat defying the whole damn town. When he finally drew back, their foreheads rested together. Her lips trembled, her eyes wet. But her smile was radiant, fearless. The fiddler's bow slowed. The final note hung in the air. No one spoke. Eli turned to the crowd again, voice rough but steady. "Let them say what they will. I've made my choice. And Clara, still breathless, added softly, so have I. Silence. Then, somewhere near the back, a single clap. Then another. Until, slowly, the sound spread. Uneasy at first, then swelling into applause that rolled across the square like thunder. Not everyone joined in. Some sneered, some turned away, but others clapped harder, their faces lit with something almost like shame and maybe admiration. Eli took Clara's hand, holding it high for all to see. "The world's full of cruel tongues," he said, "but I've found one honest heart. That's worth every whisper." The sheriff's smirk had vanished. He spat into the dust, muttering, "You're both fools." Eli smiled faintly. "Then let us be fools." He led her toward their horses as the crowd parted. Silent now, except for the soft creak of wood and wind. At the edge of town, Clara turned once more to look back, not with bitterness, but triumph. Then she faced forward, her hands still clasped in Eli's, and the two of them rode into the burning horizon, free, defiant, and bound by a love that no law could name.